The wind that whipped off the Atlantic and funneled down the chimney pots of Lochdubh was not a polite wind. It did not knock, it hammered. It stripped the last of the autumn leaves from the rowan trees and sent them skittering like terrified crabs across the cobalt waters of the loch. To the residents of the village, it was a signal to batten down the hatches and put an extra peat on the fire. To Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, it was a legitimate excuse to do absolutely nothing. Hamish stood in the lee of the police station, his back pressed against the whitewashed roughcast, finding the 1 square foot of shelter where the gale couldn't reach him. He was engaged in his favourite police procedure, surveillance of the horizon. To the untrained eye, it looked remarkably like a tall, lanky man with flaming red hair staring into space while dreaming of a bacon roll. To Hamish, it was a vital civic duty. If the horizon decided to commit a crime, he would be the first to know. At his feet, Lugs, a small dog of indeterminate breeding and low ambition, let out a huff of boredom. Lugs was currently chewing on a discarded whelk shell, a task he approached with more enthusiasm than he ever showed for guarding the law. "It's a bit fresh, Lugs," Hamish murmured, pulling the collar of his greatcoat up to his ears. "A day for soup. Mrs. Wellington might be making her lentil broth. If we time it right, we could accidentally bump into her just as she's taking the pot off the stove." The village of Lochdubh lay stretched out before them, a string of pearls against the dark, brooding mass of the mountains. It was a place where time didn't just slow down, it often stopped to have a chat and forgot to start again. Hamish liked it that way. He liked that he knew exactly which sheep belonged to which croft, and that the biggest scandal of the month had been the postmistress, Mrs. Mac Crumb, receiving a letter addressed to the occupier which she had taken as a personal slight. But the peace of the Highlands is a fragile thing, usually shattered by one of two things: the government in Edinburgh, or an Englishman with a vision. The disruption arrived not with a bang, but with the aggressive crunch of tyres on gravel. A vehicle as large and black as a hearse, but significantly shinier, nosed its way down the single-track road, bullying the verges, and forcing a local tractor to reverse into a ditch. It was a Range Rover of the type that had never seen a range, nor roved further than a Chelsea curb. Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that was lost in the wind. "Here comes trouble, Lugs. I can smell the expensive aftershave from here." The car sped off in front of the Lochdubh Hotel. The driver's door opened and a man left. He was dressed in what a London tailor imagined a Highland laird might wear for a spot of grouse shooting: brand-new tweed breeches, a gilet that puffed out like a life raft, and a flat cap worn at a jaunty angle. "That," Hamish observed, "is a brave look for a Tuesday." The man, whose name was Rupert St. John, did not look at the view. He did not inhale the fresh air. He looked immediately at his watch, then marched toward the hotel entrance, shouting into a mobile phone, "I don't care about the planning permission, Giles. Just bribe the council. Incentivize them. I want cliff diggers by Monday. This is heritage, Giles. I'm saving these peasants from their own history." Hamish peeled himself off the wall. His stomach rumbled, reminding him of the lentil soup. But duty, or at least curiosity, was calling. He ambled down the hill, adopting his best village idiot gait, shoulders slumped, mouth slightly open, eyes wide and vacant. It was a disguise that had saved him from promotion for 10 years. He reached the hotel just as St. John was haranguing the bewildered receptionist, a young girl named Isla who looked as though she was about to cry. "I specifically requested a room with a view of the dig site." St. John was bellowing, slamming a leather portfolio onto the counter. "I need to see the cliffs. I need to feel the vibrations of the past. And this coffee," he gestured to a complimentary cup, "tastes like battery acid." "It's instant, sir," Isla squeaked. "Excuse me, sir." Hamish's voice drifted in, soft and lilting, like a gentle breeze before a storm. "Is there a problem? We don't often see such excitement before lunchtime." St. John spun around, looking Hamish up and down with open disdain. He took in the frayed cuffs of the uniform, the unpolished boots, and the general air of relaxation. "And who are you?" St. John sneered. The parking attendant. PC Hamish Macbeth, Hamish said, touching the peak of his cap. And this is Lugs. He's in the drug squad. We keep him on a strict diet of whelks to keep him sharp. St. John snorted. Police? You look like you just fell out of a hayloft. I am Rupert St. John. I have purchased the land encompassing the old castle cliffs. I intend to excavate the smuggler caves and turn them into an immersive historical experience. The smuggler's descent. It will be magnificent. A glass elevator going right down into the rock face. Hamish felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the wind. The castle cliffs were treacherous. The rock was rotten, crumbling shale held together by moss and hope. The locals didn't go near the caves. They were unstable, and according to legend, they were the resting place of Black Dougal, a smuggler who hadn't taken kindly to being disturbed in 1750 and likely wouldn't appreciate a glass elevator now. The cliffs are a wee bit crumbly for elevators, sir, Hamish said mildly, and the locals use that path for the sheep. If you start digging, half the mountain might decide to join you in the sea. Nonsense, St. John waved a hand dismissively. I've had surveys done. I'm from London. Using satellite data. I don't need a local yokel telling me about geology. I'm bringing money to this backwater. Jobs, culture. I'm going to put Lochdubh on the map. Lochdubh is already on the map, sir, Hamish noted. It's right there, next to the water. You know what I mean, St. John snapped. Now go away and arrest a sheep or whatever it is you do. I have investors to call. And tell this girl to bring me a real espresso, or I'll buy the hotel and fire her. He turned his back on Hamish and marched into the dining room, the sound of his voice booming off the panelled walls. Hamish stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. Isla looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. He's going to blow up the cliffs, Hamish, she whispered. My granny says those caves are cursed. She says the ground is hollow. Aye, Hamish said, his eyes narrowing slightly, the vacancy replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The ground is hollow, Isla, and so is that man's head. But don't you worry. The Highlands have a way of dealing with men who shout too loud. He turned to leave, his hunger for soup replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. St. John wasn't just an annoyance. He was a wrecking ball. He was the kind of man who didn't care whose foot he stepped on, as long as his boots remained shiny. And in Lochdubh, stepping on the wrong foot or the wrong patch of loose rock could be fatal. Come on, Lugs, Hamish said, pushing the door open and stepping back into the biting wind. I think we'd best go and see the minister. If there's to be digging at the cliffs, there might be things buried there that people would prefer to stay buried, and I don't mean smugglers. As he walked away, the wind howled around the eaves of the hotel, sounding suspiciously like a warning. The following morning brought with it a sky the colour of a bruised plum and a rain that fell not in drops, but in sheets of grey malice. It was the kind of weather that felt personal, as if the heavens had a specific grudge against anyone foolish enough to step outside. Inside the Lochdubh police station, however, the air was thick with the comforting, heavy scent of frying bacon. Hamish Macbeth stood over his small stove, a fork in one hand and a look of deep concentration on his face. The bacon was at a critical juncture, the precise moment between limp and disappointing and crisp perfection, and Hamish was not a man to take such matters lightly. He had just successfully flipped the rashers when the telephone on his desk began to ring. It was a shrill, demanding sound that cut through the sizzling peace of the kitchen. Hamish did not move. He simply stared at the instrument with a look of mild betrayal. He knew, with the weary certainty of a man who had served the Highlands for too long, that nothing good ever came from a ringing phone before 9 o'clock. It was either headquarters demanding a report he hadn't written, or a local with a complaint about a sheep that looked at them funny. He let it ring 4 times, hoping the caller would take the hint and surrender to the apathy of the morning. They did not. With a sigh that seemed to originate from the soles of his boots, Hamish turned down the gas under the skillet, sacrificing the perfect crispness of his breakfast, and picked up the receiver. "Lochdubh police," he said. his voice thick with a deceptive drowsiness. "Constable Macbeth speaking. Hamish, you need to come to the cliff. Now!" The voice was high-pitched and bordering on hysterical. It belonged to Geordie MacGregor, a local man whose primary occupation was avoiding work and whose secondary talent was finding trouble. Geordie had been hired by Rupert St. John the previous day to clear some brush, a job Geordie had accepted only because it allowed him to scout the land for future poaching opportunities. "Calm down, Geordie," Hamish said, casting a longing look at his cooling bacon. "What is it? Has the Englishman found a rock he doesn't like? Or have you accidentally cut through a power line again?" "It's no a power line, Hamish. It's him. It's the laird. He's swinging." "Swinging." Hamish frowned, scratching the red stubble on his chin. "Is he building a playground now?" "No, he's dead, Hamish. He's hanging from the digger. Just come. I'm no staying here with him staring at me like that." The line went dead. Hamish stared at the receiver for a moment before placing it gently back in the cradle. He looked at Luggs, who was watching the frying pan with intense, hypnotic devotion. "Well, Luggs," Hamish said softly, "it seems breakfast is cancelled. Mr. St. John has decided to become a feature of the landscape sooner than expected." Hamish turned off the stove completely. He grabbed his heavy police greatcoat, which smelled permanently of wet wool and peat smoke, and jammed his peaked cap onto his unruly mop of red hair. He didn't rush. Rushing in the Highlands was a sure way to miss the details, and besides, the dead were notoriously patient. He walked out to the Land Rover, the rain instantly soaking the legs of his trousers, and hauled himself into the driver's seat. Luggs hopped into the passenger side, looking disgruntled at the lack of bacon, but willing to participate in a drive. The trip to Castle Cliffs was a treacherous affair. The track, never designed for anything heavier than a donkey cart, had been churned into a soup of mud and gravel by St. John's heavy machinery. The Land Rover skidded and groaned, its wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. As Hamish navigated the hairpin bends, he could see the angry whitecaps of the sea crashing against the rocks far below. The landscape looked wild and inhospitable, a stark contrast to the tidy, manicured vision St. John had shouted about in the hotel lobby. When Hamish finally crested the hill, the construction site came into view. It was a scar on the green turf, a chaotic mess of mud, orange safety fencing and silent machinery. In the centre of the clearing stood a massive yellow excavator. Its hydraulic arm extended out over the precipice of the cliff, poised like a scorpion's tail ready to strike. And there, dangling from the bucket of the excavator, was Rupert St. John. Hamish parked the Land Rover and entered the gale. He didn't approach immediately. He stood by the bonnet of the car, shielding his eyes from the rain, and simply looked. It was a tableau of grotesque humiliation. St. John was not hanging by a rope. He was encased in a heavy-duty cargo net, the kind used for lifting pallets of stone. The net had been cinched tight at the top and hooked onto the teeth of the excavator's bucket. He was suspended about 10 feet in the air, swaying gently in the wind, with the terrifying drop to the jagged rocks of the bay waiting below him. He was dressed in his tweed breeches and puffy gilet, but the flat cap was gone, revealing a bald spot that was rapidly turning blue in the cold. His face was pressed against the mesh of the net, eyes wide and staring, mouth frozen in a silent scream of indignity. But the crowning touch, the detail that made Hamish tilt his head in grim appreciation of the killer's dark humour, was the object stuffed into the top of the net, resting against St. John's chest. It was a plastic caution, men at work sign. "God help us," Hamish muttered, walking slowly toward the machine. He wanted an immersive experience. He certainly got one. Geordie was huddled in the cab of a small dumper truck, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands. He jumped out as Hamish approached. "I didn't touch him, Hamish, I swear. I came up to start the generator and saw him just dangling there like a sack of potatoes." "I believe you, Geordie," Hamish said, his voice calm and grounding amidst the hysteria. "You don't have the head for heights, and you certainly don't know how to operate a 30-ton excavator." Hamish walked around the base of the machine. The ground was a quagmire of mud. There were footprints everywhere. Heavy, treaded boot prints that belonged to the workmen, tire tracks, and the deep gouges of the machine's treads. It was a forensic nightmare. Any specific tracks left by the killer would have been washed away by the rain or trampled by the site's clutter. He looked up at the body. The excavator arm had been swung out deliberately. Whoever had done this knew how to work the controls. They had scooped St. John up, or perhaps knocked him out and loaded him in, and then hoisted him into the void. It was a display of power. It was a message that said, "You bring your machines to conquer the rock, then let the machine eat you." "He's been there a while," Hamish noted, observing the stiffness of the limbs through the netting. "Since last night, likely. The rain has washed him clean." Did he fall?" Geordie asked, though he knew the answer. "Men do not fall into cargo nets and hoist themselves over cliffs, Geordie," Hamish said dryly. "This was murder, and a very theatrical one at that." Hamish felt a familiar weariness settle into his bones. This wasn't a drunken brawl or a domestic dispute. This was calculated. It required planning, strength, and a cold, hard anger. He thought of the villagers he had seen yesterday, the quiet resentment in the eyes of the fisherman, the fear in Isla the receptionist, the stoic disapproval of the minister. Any of them could have wanted St. John gone. But to do this? This required a particular kind of Highland malice. "Right," Hamish sighed, pulling his notebook from his pocket, though it was instantly spotted with rain. "Geordie, go back down to the village. Do not speak to anyone. Do not tell Mrs. Mac Crum at the post office that the Englishman is hanging like a kipper. I need to call this in." "Call it in?" Geordie looked horrified. "You mean him?" "Aye," Hamish said, looking at the grey horizon where the road from Strathbane lay. "DCI Blair. He'll be here within the hour, shouting and stamping and ruining the evidence. So I suggest you vanish, Geordie, before he decides to arrest you for looking shifty." Geordie didn't need telling twice. He scrambled into his truck and reversed down the track at a speed that was bordering on reckless. Hamish was left alone with the swinging corpse and the howling wind. He walked to the excavator's cab. The door was unlatched. He peered inside, careful not to touch anything. The key was still in the ignition. On the floor of the cab, sitting innocently on the rubber mat, was a thermos flask. Hamish leaned in and sniffed. It smelled of coffee, cheap instant coffee. The same kind is served at the hotel. He stepped back, wiping the rain from his face. The peace of Lochdubh had been shattered indeed. His breakfast was ruined, his boots were soaked, and a man was dead in a cargo net. But as Hamish looked at the sheer drop beneath the body, his mind began to whir with the silent, deceptive speed of a predatory bird. He wasn't thinking about forensics or DNA. He was thinking about the coffee. He was thinking about the fact that St. John drank espresso and hated the hotel brew. So who had been sitting in the cab drinking bad coffee and waiting for the laird to come out in the dark? "Come on, Lugs," Hamish called to the dog, who was sniffing suspiciously at a pile of gravel. "We have a brief window of sanity before the circus arrives. Let's see what else the rain hasn't washed away." The silence of the cliffside was not destined to last. It was broken not by the cry of a gull or the crash of a wave, but by the discordant mechanical wail of sirens that seemed to mourn their own existence as they wound their way up the tortuous single-track road. Hamish Macbeth leaned against the muddy wheel arch of his Land Rover, shielding a flickering match from the wind as he lit a cigarette, watching the cavalcade of Strathbane police vehicles approach. They arrived with all the subtlety of a brass band falling down a flight of stairs, tires screeching unnecessarily on the wet gravel, blue lights flashing against the grey sky, in a display of authority that impressed absolutely no one, least of all the dead man swinging in the breeze. The lead car, a heavy saloon that sat low on its suspension, skidded to a halt inches from a patch of treacherous scree. The door flew open, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair emerged. If the landscape was rugged and majestic, Blair was a human counterpoint, a man composed entirely of high blood pressure, bad temper, and cheap polyester. His face was already a frightening shade of purple, a colour that clashed violently with the orange, safety fencing of the construction site. He stepped out, his polished city shoe sinking immediately into a 6-inch puddle of oily mud. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice cracking with the strain of shouting over the wind. He stared down at his ruined shoe, then up at Hamish, as if the constable had personally arranged the puddle for his discomfort. What in the name of sanity is this? Why is there a man dangling like a Christmas bauble over a precipice? Have you not heard of preserving dignity, you ginger-haired moron? "I didn't put him there, sir," Hamish said, his voice mild and drifting away on the gale. "And I didn't think it was my place to bring him down. Gravity is a tricky thing on these cliffs, and I wouldn't want to drop the evidence into the Atlantic before you had a chance to shout at it." Blair stomped forward, followed by his usual entourage of detectives, Anderson and MacNab, who looked like wet ferrets seeking a hole to hide in. Blair ignored the crime scene tape Hamish had strung up, using a bit of twine found in his pocket, and marched straight toward the excavator, his heavy feet obliterating the tire tracks in the mud. "Look at this," Blair sneered, gesturing at the swaying cargo net. "It's grotesque. It's medieval. Who is he? The Englishman? St. John?" "Aye, sir, Rupert St. John, the developer. Well, he's developed himself into a right mess, hasn't he?" Blair let out a harsh, barking laugh that sounded like a seal choking. He walked right up to the edge of the cliff, peering at the caution, men at work signs stuffed into the net. "Look at that. A joke. A sick joke. This isn't a robbery, Macbeth. This is a statement. It's probably one of these eco-terrorists, or a local lunatic who didn't like his view being spoiled." "I found a thermos in the cab, sir," Hamish ventured, pointing a long finger toward the excavator. "It smells of instant coffee, the bad stuff. Mr. St. John only drank espresso. He made quite a scene about it at the hotel yesterday." Blair turned, his face contorted with disdain. "Coffee? I have a dead man wrapped in a fishing net, suspended over a 100-foot drop, and you're talking to me about coffee? God, you are useless. A true peasant detective. Do you think the killer stopped for a tea break? Oh, I'll just hoist this 13-stone man into the air, but first, let me have a nice cup of Nescafé. Don't be an idiot." "It implies he wasn't alone, sir," Hamish persisted gently, though he knew it was a waste of breath, or that he was meeting someone he knew, someone who brought him a drink to keep him warm while they waited. Or, Blair countered, stepping closer and jabbing a finger into Hamish's chest, he brought it himself because it was freezing cold and he wasn't as fussy as you claim. Or maybe he stole it. Rich men are always tight with money. That's how they stay rich. Now, get out of my way before you contaminate the scene with your incompetence. Anderson, get the photographer over here, and get that body down. Carefully. If you drop him, I'll have you on traffic duty in Glasgow until you retire." Hamish backed away, retreating to safety from lugs and the Land Rover. He watched Blair's team swarm the site. They were efficient in their clumsiness, trampling the delicate moss, kicking aside stones that might have held fingerprints, and shouting instructions that were carried away by the wind. Blair was already on his radio, likely calling the superintendent to declare the case solved before it had even begun. "It's Geordie MacGregor, isn't it?" Blair suddenly shouted, returning to Hamish. "He was working here. You said he called it in. He's a poacher, a thief, and a general nuisance. He probably had a row with the Englishman over wages, bashed him on the head and strung him up. It's classic class warfare. The savage local versus the civilized incomer." "Geordie is afraid of heights, sir," Hamish said. "He gets dizzy standing on a chair. And he doesn't know how to work a digger. He can barely work a toaster. Rubbish. Everyone here can drive a tractor, so they can drive a digger. It's all just levers and mud. Bring him in, Macbeth. Go down to the village and arrest him. I want him in the cells at Strathbane by tonight. And wipe that vacuous look off your face. You look like a sheep that's lost its flock." "I'll go and find him, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap. "But I think you'll find Geordie was in the pub until closing last night. He has a lot of witnesses." "Accomplices!" Blair roared. "They're all accomplices in this backward little hellhole. Just go, and don't come back until you have him in handcuffs. I don't want you hovering around here, breathing my air and making the place look untidy." Hamish climbed into the Land Rover, the engine coughing into life with a reluctant shudder. As he reversed down the track, he took one last look at the scene. Blair was standing with his hands on his hips, staring up at the swinging corpse, looking for all the world like a man who thought he had conquered the mountain. But Hamish knew better. He knew that by trampling the mud, Blair had destroyed the story the ground could have told, and by dismissing the coffee, he had ignored the only human element in a mechanical crime. "He's a fool, Lugs," Hamish said to the dog, who was licking a paw with studied indifference. "He sees a monster where there's only a man, and he sees a simple poacher where there's a mystery. But let him chase Geordie. It keeps him busy, and while he's shouting at the innocent, we can go and have a quiet word with the guilty." Hamish steered the vehicle down the winding road, the rain drumming a rhythmic beat on the roof. He wasn't going to arrest Geordie. He knew exactly where Geordie would be, hiding under his bed with a bottle of whiskey. Instead, Hamish's mind was drifting back to the village, to the warm, dry interiors of the cottages, where secrets were kept like precious heirlooms. The coffee was the key. Someone had sat in that cab with St. John. Someone who knew him well enough to share a drink, but hated him enough to turn him into a warning sign. And in a village the size of Lochdubh, someone was a very short list indeed. The drive back down the glen was a journey from the ridiculous to the sublime, or at least from the chaotic shouting of Detective Chief Inspector Blair to the warm, yeasty embrace of the village bakery. Hamish Macbeth did not go looking for Geordie MacGregor. He knew that finding Geordie would only cause paperwork and a cell for a man whose only crime was an unfortunate proximity to a corpse. Instead, Hamish steered the Land Rover toward the heart of Lochdubh, his stomach guiding him with the unerring precision of a homing pigeon. He parked in front of the post office and general store, a building that served as the village's unofficial parliament. The sign on the door said closed, which usually meant Mrs. Macrum was in the back making tea. Hamish tried the handle. It opened with a welcoming groan. Mrs. Macrum was indeed behind the counter, sorting a stack of letters with the grim determination of a card shark. She looked up as Hamish entered, shaking her head. "I heard the sirens, Hamish. Sounded like the end of the world. Is it true? Is the Englishman suspended?" "Aye, Mrs. Macrum," Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the counter and adopting his most pitiful expression. "It's a terrible business. And me without a scrap of breakfast in my belly. The DCI's up there now, shouting at the seagulls." "That man Blair," she tutted, reaching under the counter and producing a tin of shortbread. "He has the manners of a goat. Here, take a biscuit. You look peaky." Hamish accepted the offering with a murmur of gratitude. "I don't suppose Mr. St. John was in here much? A man of his tastes? Him?" Mrs. Macrum sniffed. "He was in here every day, complaining about the price of stamps. For a man who claimed to be bringing millions to the Highlands, he was very careful with his pennies. He was receiving a lot of mail, Hamish. Registered letters. Red envelopes." Hamish paused, a crumb of shortbread hovering halfway to his mouth. "Red envelopes? That sounds like final demands." "That's what I thought," she whispered conspiratorially. "He was playing the big man, but I think the money was running out. He tried to pay for a newspaper with a credit card Tuesday, but it was declined." He turned purple. Blamed the machine, of course. Said our internet connection was primitive. But the machine was working fine for Mrs. Wellington's pension 5 minutes later. So a rich man with no money, Hamish mused. That makes people desperate. Did he have any friends? Anyone he might have been meeting up at the cliffs? Friends? No. But he was seen arguing with folk. He had a shouting match with Archie McLean on the pier. Archie said the digging was disturbing the fishing. St. John told him he'd buy his boat and turn it into a planter for petunias. Hamish finished the biscuit and brushed the crumbs from his tunic. A charmer to the end. "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Macrum. I'd best be moving on before Blair realizes I'm not scouring the hills for Geordie." He retreated to the wet street. The revelation that St. John was broken and changed the complexion of the crime. It suggested that the immersive experience wasn't a vanity project, but a last-ditch attempt to dig his way out of debt. And if he was broke, he couldn't pay his contractors. His next stop was the Lochdubh Hotel, Not for official inquiries, but because the back door to the kitchen was usually unlocked and Mrs. Wellington, despite her formidable reputation, had a soft spot for lugs. He found her chopping carrots with a violence that suggested the vegetables had personally offended her. "Hamish," she barked without looking up. "If you're looking for handouts, the soup isn't ready. If you're looking for the Englishman, he's checked. Permanently, I hear." "News travels fast," Hamish said, settling onto a stool near the warmth of the ovens. Lugs immediately located a dropped piece of gristle and began to investigate it. "I was just wondering about his coffee habits, Mrs. Wellington. He made a fuss about your brew." "The man was a Philistine," she shouted, pointing a knife at Hamish. "He demanded single origin artisan roast. I told him the only single origin he'd get here was Nescafe from the cash and carry. But here's the funny thing, Hamish. For all his shouting, I saw him sneaking a thermos out of the kitchen yesterday evening. He filled it himself, with instant stuff. The very stuff he said tasted like battery acid." Hamish sat up straighter. He took a thermos of instant coffee, aye, a big red tartan one. He thought I didn't see him. He looked rattling, nervous, like a man engaging in a vice he didn't want the world to know about, or like a man preparing to meet someone who liked instant coffee, Hamish said softly. Someone he couldn't afford to offend. "Did he say where he was going?" "No, but he asked Isla for the key to the back gate, the one that leads to the cliff path. He didn't want to be seen leaving through the front lobby." Hamish nodded, his mind working through the implications. St. John, the snob, sneaking out with a flask of the peasant coffee he claimed to despise. It spoke of a meeting with someone local, someone who wouldn't be impressed by espresso, someone he needed to keep sweet. Or perhaps someone he was afraid of. "You're a marvel, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, standing up, "and that soup smells divine. Perhaps later, when the world is less full of policemen." "Away with you," she grumbled, though she slipped a warm bannock into his pocket as he passed. Hamish walked down to the harbour, munching on the bread. The wind had dropped, leaving the loch a flat steel grey mirror. He saw Archie McLean mending nets on the quay. Archie was a man of few words, most of them unprintable. "Hamish," Archie grunted, not looking up. "I didn't kill him, though I thought about it." "I know, Archie," Hamish said, leaning against a bollard. "Mrs. Macrum says he was broke. Is that true?" "Broke as a joke," Archie spat. "He tried to get me to take some of his investors out on the boat for a tour, said he'd pay me next month. I told him I don't work on credit for men who wear white trousers in October. He got nasty. Said he knew things about the village. Said he'd dig up more than just rocks if we didn't cooperate." "Dig up more than rocks," Hamish repeated. "Now that is an interesting phrase. Aye." He was looking for something specific, Hamish. He wasn't just digging a hole for an elevator. He was looking for something in the caves. He had an old map, not a survey map, a hand-drawn thing. He dropped it once, and I saw it. It looked like something out of a history book. Hamish looked up at the cliffs, now shrouded in mist. St. John wasn't building a tourist trap. He was treasure hunting. He was looking for something Black Dougal had left behind, something that would pay off his red envelopes, and he had taken a thermos of coffee to share with someone, an accomplice, a guide. "Thanks, Archie," Hamish said, pushing himself off the bollard. "If Blair asks, you were where you always are." "Invisible," Archie agreed. Hamish walked back toward the police station, his mooching having yielded a harvest of debt, deception, and a mysterious map. Blair was up on the hill chasing a poacher, convinced it was a class war. But Hamish knew it was something older. It was about greed, and in the Highlands greed was a dangerous thing to bring to a cliff edge, especially when you were standing on hollow ground. He needed to find that map, and he had a suspicion that if St. John had dropped it, he might not have been the only one to see it. The drive to Tommel Castle was a study in contrasts. Hamish Macbeth's battered Land Rover, smelling of wet dog and ancient upholstery, rattled up the sweeping gravel driveway that was lined with rhododendrons manicured to within an inch of their lives. The castle itself, A Victorian monstrosity of turrets and crenellations loomed out of the mist like a stone wedding cake that had been left out in the rain. It was the home of Colonel Halberton Smythe, a man who regarded Hamish with the same enthusiasm he usually reserved for a calm day on the grouse moors, which is to say, deep suspicion. But it was not the colonel Hamish had come to see. He parked around the back, avoiding the main entrance where the colonel's terrifying butler might intercept him, and slipped into the kitchen. The staff, long accustomed to the copper's foraging habits, barely looked up. He navigated through the steam of the scullery and found himself in the small private sitting room often used by the housegirl. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was sitting by the fire, a stack of ledgers on her lap and a fountain pen in her hand. She looked, as she always did, effortlessly elegant. Her blonde hair was swept back in a way that defied the Highland humidity, and she wore a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Hamish's entire wardrobe. She looked up as he entered, her blue eyes cooling slightly, though a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Hamish," she said, closing the ledger with a snap. "I assume you're not here to arrest Father for shooting a protected species, although given his mood this morning, he might well have done." "The colonel is safe from the law today, Priscilla," Hamish said, removing his sodden cap and running a hand through his fiery hair. "I am here on official business. Investigating a murder, you know. Official business that coincidentally brings you near the tea tray." She gestured to the silver pot on the table. "Help yourself. It's Earl Grey, not that tar you drink at the station." Hamish poured a cup, adding 3 sugars while Priscilla pretended not to notice. He settled into the chair opposite her, lugs having been left in the Land Rover to guard a particularly interesting stick. "It's a bad business, Priscilla," he said, blowing on the tea. "St. John, hanging from his own digger, a very public way to go." "It's ghastly," she agreed, her expression sobering. "Father is furious, of course, not because a man is dead, but because the police tape is ruining the view from the library. But Hamish, you didn't drive all the way up here just to tell me St. John is dead. I have the internet, and Mrs. Macrum calls me every hour." Hamish leaned forward, the china cup looking fragile in his large hands. "I know you spoke to him, Priscilla. He was staying at the hotel before he moved to the Lochdubh hotel. He was trying to charm the local gentry. What did he want?" Priscilla sighed, standing up to poke the fire. "He was a dreadful little man, Hamish, all bluster and veneer. He came to dinner last week. He spent the entire evening trying to convince Father to invest in his Cliffs of History project. He kept talking about monetizing the heritage. And did the colonel bite? Heavens, no. Father told him that the only thing buried in those cliffs were sheep bones and rusty tractor parts. But St. John wouldn't let it. He was desperate, Hamish. I could smell it on him. It wasn't just enthusiasm, it was panic. I heard he was broke, Hamish nodded. Read letters at the post office. It was worse than that, Priscilla said, turning to face him. He cornered me in the hallway after dinner. He wasn't flirting, which was a mercy, but he was asking very odd questions. He wanted to know about the local legends, specifically about the smuggler's hoard. He asked if we had any records in the castle archives, old maps, diaries, that sort of thing. Did you help him? I told him the archives were dusty and boring, but he was insistent. He asked if I knew of anyone in the village who acted as a custodian of secrets. He used that phrase. He said he had a silent partner who was helping him, but he didn't trust them. He wanted a second opinion on a map he'd been given. Hamish sat, tea forgotten. A map? Archie McLean mentioned a map. Saint. John dropped it on the pier. He showed it to me, Priscilla said, her brow furrowing. He pulled it out of his jacket pocket like it was a holy relic. He claimed it showed the entrance to a sealed cave system where Black Dougal hid his French gold. But Hamish... She paused, looking at him with a sharp intelligence that made his heart ache with a familiar hopeless longing. It wasn't an old map. It was drawn on modern graph paper. The ink was barely dry. And the handwriting... I've seen it before. Where? Hamish asked softly. It was blocky, childish almost, but very precise. It looked exactly like the handwriting on the invoices we get for the dry stone wall repairs. or the bills for the gravel delivery. Tam Brodie, Hamish suggested. Or maybe Geordie? No, not them. Their writing is like a spider dipped in ink. This was distinctive. It had a peculiar slant, but he snatched it away before I could get a good look. The point is, Hamish, he was being led. Someone sold him a story about gold in those cliffs, and he bought it because he was desperate for a miracle to pay off his debts. He wasn't digging for history, he was digging for a lifeline. Hamish sat back, absorbing this. St. John, the arrogant outsider, had been fleeced. He had been sold a pup by a local. But then, why kill him? If you're conning a man, you keep him alive until his wallet is empty. Unless St. John had found out the map was a fake. Unless he had taken that thermos of instant coffee up to the cliffs to confront his silent partner and demand his money back. He took instant coffee with him last night, Hamish mused aloud. To the meeting. He hated the stuff. Priscilla raised an eyebrow. Instant? St. John wouldn't water his plants with instant coffee. Unless he was trying to be polite. Or unless he wasn't the one drinking it. Exactly, Hamish said. He was meeting someone who likes cheap stuff. Someone he needed to keep calm. Someone who drew a map on graph paper and promised him gold. He looked at Priscilla. She was so composed, so out of his league. She offered him a window into a world he didn't understand, the world of desperation masked by tweed and dinner parties. "You've been a great help, Priscilla," he said, standing. "As always. I should probably go before the Colonel decides to use me for target practice." "Hamish," she said, stopping him at the door, "be careful." If St. John was desperate enough to believe in fairy tales, the person who sold them to him must be very convincing, and very dangerous. People in Lochdubh don't like it when their secrets are dug up. "I know," Hamish said, putting on his cap. "But the thing about digging holes, Priscilla, is that eventually you have to climb into them." He returned to Land Rover, his mind racing. The handwriting on the map, graph paper, instant coffee. The killer wasn't a stranger. It was someone who knew the cliffs, someone who could draw, and someone who saw St. John not as a developer, but as a mark. And when the mark realized he'd been strung up like a warning flag. Hamish patted Lugs on the head. "Come on, boy. We need to find someone with a supply of graph paper and a taste for bad coffee. And I think I know where to start looking. It's time we stopped mooching and started acting like the police. At least, until Blair comes back." The descent from Tommel Castle was swift, aided by gravity and the Land Rover's alarming tendency to shudder violently if the brakes were applied with any real conviction. Hamish Macbeth's mind, however, was moving slower, sifting through the silt of the case like a gold panna in a muddy burn. He had a dead Englishman, a fake treasure map drawn on graph paper, and a missing silent partner who drank cheap instant coffee. When he arrived back at the Lochdubh police station, the peace he had briefly reclaimed had been thoroughly routed. The front door was wide open, and the interior sounded like a cattle auction gone wrong. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was standing in the centre of the room, his face flushed with a kind of triumphant glow, usually reserved for dictators and lottery winners. Slumped in the prisoner's chair, looking as if he wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole, was Geordie MacGregor. He was handcuffed to the radiator, a dramatic and entirely unnecessary measure given that Geordie's current state of terror had rendered him incapable of standing, let alone fleeing. "Ah, Macbeth," Blair boomed, spotting Hamish in the doorway. "Back from your little drive? You missed the breakthrough. Real police work, laddie, fast, aggressive, effective." Hamish closed the door against the wind, his eyes drifting over the scene. "I see you've caught the mastermind, sir. Geordie MacGregor, the man who once got stuck in a phone box because he forgot how to push the door." "Don't give me that," Blair sneered, snatching a plastic evidence bag from the desk and shaking it in Hamish's face. "Look at this." We searched his pockets. £500, Macbeth. In cash. Crisp 20s. And where does a layabout poacher get £500 on a Tuesday? Hamish looked at the money. He knew exactly where it had come from. Geordie had sold a particularly fine stag to the hotel chef in Strathbane 2 nights ago, a transaction that had involved a lot of whispering and a back door left conveniently unlatched. But to admit that would be to arrest Geordie for poaching, which seemed cruel given the current circumstances. "He says he found it," Anderson piped up from the corner, where he was nursing a bruised shin. "Said it fell off a lorry." "Lying thief," Blair spat. "It's a payoff. Or robbery money. He killed St. John, took the cash from his wallet and tied him. It's open and shut. I've already called the Procurator Fiscal." Hamish approached Geordie, who looked up with wide, watery eyes. "Hamish," he whimpered. "Tell him. I didn't kill the man. I was nowhere near the cliffs last night. I was watching football. Alone, I suppose?" Blair mocked. "Aye, alone. But I didn't do it." Hamish crouched, ignoring Blair's impatience. He looked closely at Geordie's hands. They were trembling, ingrained with engine oil and peat, but they were not the hands of a killer who could hoist a 13-stone man into the air. "Geordie," Hamish said softly, "did Mr. St. John ever offer you a drink? Coffee, perhaps?" Geordie looked confused. "Coffee? I dinna drink the stuff, Hamish. You know that. It gives me palpitations. I'm a tea man, strong and sweet." Hamish stood up and turned to Blair. "Mr. St. John took a thermos of instant coffee to the cliffs, sir. Geordie here breaks out in a sweat if he smells a roasted bean, and he's terrified of heights. If he tried to climb into that excavator cab, he'd faint before he hit the seat." "Details!" Blair waved a dismissive hand. He probably had help. Maybe he hired a mercenary with his ill-gotten gains. "The point is, he had the money, he was on the site, and he's a known criminal. I'm taking him to Strathbane. You can stay here and tidy up this mess. And Macbeth, try to look like a cop once in your life. You're depressing the property values." Hamish watched as they hauled Geordie to the waiting car. The poacher cast a desperate look back at Hamish, a silent plea that tugged at the constable's conscience. Blair was making a mistake, a loud and obvious one, but that was Blair's specialty. And in a strange way it was helpful. As long as Blair was chasing Geordie, the real killer would feel safe. They would relax. They might even make a mistake. Once the sirens had faded into the distance, Hamish fetched lugs from the Land Rover and set off on foot. He needed to find the source of the graph paper. He walked to the village store, the bell chiming cheerfully as he entered. Mrs. Macbeth was still behind the counter, though she was now reading a magazine with a lurid cover promising revelations about a soap opera star. "They took Geordie," she said, not looking up. "I saw them." Blair looked like he'd won a prize at the fair. "Aye," Hamish said, leaning on the counter. "He thinks Geordie is a criminal mastermind. But I'm looking for something else, Mrs. Macbeth. Stationery." She looked up then, peering over her spectacles. "Stationery? You? Since when do you write letters, Hamish?" "It's for a project," he lied smoothly. "I'm looking for graph paper. The blue line stuff. High quality. Who buys that sort of thing in Lochdubh?" Mrs. Macbeth pursed her lips in thought. "Graph paper. Well, the school buys the cheap grey stuff. But the blue lines? That's expensive. We only stock a few pads of it. They sit on the shelf for months. Has anyone bought a pad recently?" "Let me think." She tapped a finger against her chin. "Old Mr. Ferguson used to buy it for his crosswords, but he's been dead 6 months. The only person who's bought a pad this year is Callum Macbeth. You know, the one who runs that little heritage museum in the village hall." Hamish felt a little click in his brain, like a key turning in a well-oiled lock. Callum Macbeth, a man obsessed with the past, a man who spent his days surrounded by dusty relics and old maps, a man who was constantly petitioning the council for grants to save Lochdubh's history from modern erosion. "Callum Macbeth," Hamish repeated slowly. "Of course. He'd need it for his displays, would he? Aye. He's always drawing up plans for a grand extension that he can't afford. He was here last week, actually, bought a pad of graph paper and a jar of the cheapest instant coffee we have. Said he was working late on a major discovery that was going to change everything." Hamish's heart beat a little faster. Graph paper, instant coffee, a major discovery. It fits. It fit perfectly. Macbeth was a custodian of secrets. exactly the sort of person St. John would have sought out to authenticate his fake map. Or perhaps the person who had drawn the fake map in the first place. "Did he seem happy?" Hamish asked. "Excited?" "He seemed manic, if you ask me," Mrs. Macrum sniffed. "Jittery, kept looking over his shoulder. And he paid with coins. Lots of small changes, like he'd emptied a piggy bank." Hamish thanked her and went back outside. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle that blurred the edges of the world. He looked toward the village hall at the far end of the street. The lights were off, but a small sign in the window read, "Lochdubh Heritage Centre, open by appointment." Callum Macphee was a quiet man, a man who felt ignored, a man who watched people like St. John come in with their money and their arrogance, threatening to tear up the very cliffs he worshipped. It was a classic Highland tragedy in the making: pride, poverty, and a deep, festering resentment. "Come on, lugs," Hamish whispered, turning his collar up against the damp. "We're going to the museum. I have a sudden interest in local history, specifically the history of men who draw maps to places that don't exist." He didn't march, he didn't rush. He strolled, his hands deep in his pockets, looking for all the world like a man with nowhere to go, but his eyes were fixed on the village hall, and his mind was sharpening the trap he would need to set. Blair had his prisoner, but Hamish Macbeth was about to find the truth. The Lochdubh Heritage Centre was tucked away in the back of the village hall, a draughty room that smelled permanently of floor polish, damp wool, and the slow decay of forgotten things. It was a place visited mostly by tourists seeking shelter from the rain, and locals looking for a quiet place to gossip away from the prying eyes of the minister. Hamish Macbeth pushed the heavy oak door open, wincing as the hinges gave a shriek that echoed like a banshee in a cathedral. He left lugs in the vestibule. The terrier had a regrettable history with a stuffed badger in the main display, and stepped into the gloom. Callum Macphee was hunched over a glass display case at the far end of the room, frantically polishing the smudges off the pane with a rag that looked suspiciously like an old vest. He was a thin, bird-like man with a shock of white hair that stood up in tufts, giving him the appearance of a startled heron. He wore a tweed jacket that had seen better decades, let alone days, and his fingers were stained with ink. "Afternoon, Callum," Hamish said, his voice soft enough not to disturb the dust motes dancing in the slat of grey light falling from the high window. "I see you're keeping the history bright and shiny." Callum jumped, dropping his rag. He spun around, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting a riot squad. When he saw it was only Hamish, his shoulders sagged, though the tension remained in his jaw. "Hamish, you gave me a fright. I thought it was that shouting man from Strathbane." "DCI Blair is busy," Hamish said, wandering over to a display of rusted farming implements labelled "Tools of the 19th Century. "He's taken Geordie away. Reckons Geordie is a criminal mastermind who strung up the Englishman for a bag of cash." Callum let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Geordie? A mastermind? The man can't even operate a tin opener without supervision. The police are fools, Hamish. They see what they want to see." "Aye, they do," Hamish agreed, moving to the next case, which contained a mannequin dressed in a moth-eaten Victorian dress. "But St. John is dead all the same, hanging from his own machine. A bit poetic, don't you think? Like the cliffs were fighting back." Callum's eyes lit up with a sudden fierce intensity. "It wasn't poetry, Hamish. It was justice. That man, he was a desecrator. He came here with his plastic shoes and his loud voice, talking about immersive experiences. He wanted to drill into the rock. He wanted to put a glass elevator through the smuggler's cave. You know what that would do? It would bring the whole cliff face down into the sea." Hamish watched him carefully. This wasn't the usual grumbling of a local resistant to change. This was the zealotry of a guardian. Callum Macphee didn't just work in the museum, he was the museum. His identity was wrapped up in the rusty ploughs and the faded photographs of crofters long dead. St. John hadn't just threatened the landscape, he had threatened Callum's relevance. "He was a man who didn't listen," Hamish murmured. "I heard he was looking for treasure too, the smuggler's hoard. He had a map." Callum froze. He picked up his rag and began scrubbing the glass again, harder this time. Treasure? Fairy tales for tourists. There is no gold in those caves, Hamish. Only bats and guano. If he had a map, he was a bigger fool than he looked. Hamish drifted closer to Callum's desk, a cluttered island in the sea of history. There were piles of pamphlets, a jar of pencils, and, sitting right next to a half-eaten sandwich, a large jar of instant coffee. The cheap stuff. The granules were dark and dusty against the glass. "You're working late these days, Callum?" Hamish asked, nodding at the jar. "Keeping yourself awake?" "There's a lot to do," Callum muttered, not looking up. "The roof is leaking again. The council threatens to cut funding. They say nobody cares about the past. St. John cared," Hamish said, or at least he pretended. He was asking questions about the caves, about maps. Hamish took a pencil from the desk. Underneath it was a pad of blue-lined graph paper. The top sheet had been torn off, leaving a jagged edge. He showed a map to Priscilla Halberton Smythe, drawn on graph paper just like this. She said the handwriting looked familiar. Callum stopped polishing. The silence in the room stretched thin, vibrating with the unspoken. Hamish could see the pulse jumping in the man's neck. "He laughed at me, Hamish," Callum whispered, his voice trembling. "He came in here a week ago. He offered me £50, 50, to consult on his project. He wanted me to sign a paper saying the caves were historically insignificant so he could get his planning permission. He called my museum a junk shop. He said I was sitting on a pile of rubbish. So you gave him what he wanted," Hamish said gently. "You gave him a map. I gave him a story." Callum turned, his face flushed. "I drew him a map to the unstable section, the section where the shale is loose. I told him that's where the gold was. I figured he'd dig and get scared. I thought he'd get stuck in the mud or twist an ankle and leave us alone. But he didn't just get a scare, did he?" Hamish looked at the graph paper. He figured it out. "He went there last night to confront you. He took a flask of coffee, this coffee, because he thought he could buy you off or threaten you." Callum sank onto his stool, burying his face in his hands. His fingers were stained with blue ink, the same blocky, distinctive ink Priscilla had described. "He was waiting for me. He was in the digger's cab. He was drunk on power. He told me he was going to bulldoze the museum. He said he'd make sure I never worked in heritage again. He called me a little peasant man." Hamish pitied him. He really did. St. John had been a bully, and Callum was a man pushed into a corner, fighting for the only thing he had left. And then he stepped out of the cab to shout at the wind, Callum said, his voice hollow. "He slipped. It was the mud, Hamish. He slipped and hit his head on the tracks. He was out cold. I didn't mean to kill him, but when I saw him lying there, and that machine, that monstrous machine ready to eat the cliffs, I just wanted to show him. I wanted to show him what happens when you mess with the land." "So you put him in the net," Hamish said, "and you hung him up. Like a warning. Like a flag," Callum corrected, looking up with wet eyes. "A flag for Lochdubh, to say we aren't for sale." Hamish sighed. It was a tragedy of errors and pride. Callum hadn't gone up there to murder. He had gone up there to defend his honour, and opportunity had presented itself in the grim shape of a concussion and a cargo net. But murder it was, and Blair had an innocent man in a cell. "Callum," Hamish said, "you know I can't let Geordie take the fall for this. He's a rogue, but he's not a killer." "I know," Callum whispered. "But if I confess, who will look after the museum? Who will polish the ploughs?" "The village will," Hamish said, "but not if you let an innocent man rot. However—" Hamish paused, scratching his chin. He looked at the terrified little historian, then at the graph paper, and finally at the door where Blair would eventually return. "There is a way to do this, a way that saves Geordie, clears your conscience, and perhaps, just perhaps, stops Blair from tearing this place apart looking for terrorist cells." Hamish leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "St. John is dead, and that can't be undone. But we need to make sure the truth comes out the right way. We need a trap, Callum, and you're going to help me set it. Because if there's one thing a man like Blair can't resist, it's a legend coming to life." Hamish outlined his plan. It was risky, it was theatrical, and it involved a significant amount of graph paper and the legend of Black Dougal. Callum listened, his fear slowly replaced by a flicker of the fanaticism that had driven him to the cliffs in the first place. "You want me to ghost him?" Callum asked, a weird smile touching his lips. "I want you to haunt him," Hamish corrected. "Blair thinks he's fighting a war. Let's give him a ghost story. Tonight, we go back to the cliffs." Hamish left the museum with a heavy heart but a clear purpose. He had his killer, and it wasn't a monster, it was just a sad man with a jar of instant coffee and too much pride. Now all he had to do was orchestrate a finale that would satisfy the law without destroying the village's soul, and crucially, without getting himself promoted for being too clever by half. The return of Detective Chief Inspector Blair to Lochdubh was marked by a distinct increase in the volume of the average conversation within the village limits. He had returned from Strathbane, not with Geordie MacGregor, who was safely locked up in the cells, but with a renewed sense of self-importance and a large bag of greasy chips that he was consuming with gusto at Hamish's desk. The station smelled of vinegar and cheap Triumph. Hamish Macbeth entered, shaking the rain from his coat and looking suitably downtrodden. He allowed his shoulders to slump and his expression to droop into a mask of bovine acceptance. Lugs, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure caused by Blair's ego, trotted immediately to his basket and feigned sleep. "Well, Macbeth?" Blair mumbled through a mouthful of potato. "I trust you've been making yourself useful while I've been doing the real police work. We're processing the poacher now. He's cracking. I give it another hour before he admits to the whole thing." "Oh, aye, sir," Hamish said, moving to the stove to pour himself a cup of black coffee. "Geordie is a broken man, but there is a small thing, sir. A rumour I heard down at the harbour. It's probably nothing, just local superstition." Blair stopped chewing. The word rumour to a policeman was like the scent of blood to a shark, especially when coupled with Hamish's feigned indifference. "What rumour? Out with it, man. Don't stand there chewing your lip." "It's about the map, sir," Hamish said, keeping his back to Blair. "The fishermen are saying that St. John didn't just find a nice spot for an elevator. They say he found the entrance to Black Dougal's cave, the real one, the one full of French gold." Blair's eyes lit up with a greed that was almost touching in its purity. "Gold? You mean the smuggler's hoard? I thought that was a fairy tale." "So did I, sir," Hamish lied smoothly. "But Archie McLean says he saw St. John with a map. And here's the thing. Geordie didn't have a map on him when you arrested him, did he?" "No." Blair frowned, just the cash exactly Hamish turned, his face a picture of innocent concern. "So if Geordie did it, where's the map?" "Locals say Geordie was just a muscle, a hired hand. They reckon the real brains behind the operation, the one who has the map and knows where the gold is going up to the cliffs tonight, to move the stash before the police cordon is fully secured." Blair dropped his chip wrapper into the bin. "Tonight? Are you sure?" "Well, it's a full moon, sir," Hamish said, gesturing vaguely at the rain-lashed window. "Or it would be if the clouds weren't so thick. The tide is low at midnight. That's when smugglers move. If I were a criminal mastermind with a map to a fortune, I wouldn't leave it in a muddy field. I'd go back for it." Blair stood up, wiping grease from his chin. The prospect of not only solving a murder, but also recovering a legendary hoard of gold was too much for him to resist. It was the kind of glory that led to promotions, medals, and perhaps a transfer to a nice, warm office in Edinburgh. "Right," Blair barked. "We stake it out. Tonight. No uniforms. We go in the dark. I want to catch this mastermind red-handed. And Macbeth? Yes, sir. You're coming with us. If this is a wild goose chase, you'll be on traffic duty in the Hebrides for the rest of your miserable career. But if there's gold, well, I might forget about your general incompetence." The trap was set. Hamish had already sent a message to Callum MacPhee via Mrs. McCrum, a cryptic note about graph paper and midnight that he knew the curator would understand. Callum was a man of history. He understood the dramatic necessity of a final act. The stakeout began at 11 o'clock. The rain had mercifully stopped, but the wind was still howling around the jagged peaks of the cliffs, carrying the salt spray of the Atlantic high into the air. Hamish, Blair, Anderson, and Macnab lay huddled in the bracken overlooking the construction site. The yellow excavator sat like a sleeping dinosaur in the mud, the cargo net still swinging gently in the breeze, though the body had long since been removed. It was bitterly cold. Blair was shivering violently, his teeth chattering a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like Morse code for "I hate the Highlands." Hamish, wrapped in his thick, hand-knitted jumper and greatcoat, was perfectly comfortable. He lay on his back, chewing a piece of grass, watching the clouds race across the moon. "This is ridiculous," Blair hissed after an hour of silence. "There's no one coming. It's a ghost story, Macbeth. I'm freezing to death because of a myth." "Hush, sir," Hamish whispered, pointing toward the cliff edge. "Look, a light had appeared. It wasn't the harsh beam of a torch, but a soft, flickering glow, like an old lantern. It bobbed and weaved through the darkness, moving from the direction of the old sheep path toward the excavator. The figure holding it was shrouded in a dark coat, moving with a strange, halting gait. "Is that him?" Blair breathed, reaching for his radio. "Wait, sir," Hamish cautioned, placing a hand on Blair's arm. "Let him get to the digger. We need to see what he's doing." The figure reached the machine. He placed the lantern on the ground, casting long, eerie shadows against the metal tracks. Then he produced a large sheet of paper, white against the dark mud, and held it up to the light. He seemed to be comparing it to the cliff face, tracing a line with his finger. "The map," Blair whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "He's got the map." The figure then did something unexpected. He climbed up onto the tracks of the excavator, not with the agility of a thief, but with the weary determination of a labourer. He opened the cab door and sat inside. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the engine of the great machine coughed into life, the diesel rumble shattering the night's silence. "He's stealing the digger!" Anderson yelped. "No," Hamish said softly. "He's not stealing it. Look." The excavator arm began to move. It didn't swing out toward the cliff edge this time. Instead, it curled inward, the bucket scraping against the rocky ground with a screech of metal on stone. The operator was digging. He was digging right at the base of the caution sign, tearing up the earth where St. John had planned his glass elevator. "He's going for the gold!" Blair shouted, abandoning all stealth. "Move! Go, go, go!" Blair scrambled up from the bracken, slipping in the mud but recovering with a frantic energy. Anderson and Macnab followed, their torches clicking on, beams slicing through the darkness. "Police! Stop the vehicle! Get out with your hands up!" Blair screamed, running toward the machine. The excavator stopped. The engine idled, a low, throaty growl. The cab door opened slowly. The figure stepped out, holding the lantern in one hand and the roll of paper in the other. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stood there, bathed in the harsh light of the police torches. It was Callum MacPhee. He looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the massive machine and the endless dark of the ocean. He wore his tweed jacket and his spectacles, which were misty with the damp. "Got you!" Blair yelled, panting as he reached the circle of light. "The mastermind! I knew it wasn't just the poacher! Where is it? Where's the gold?" Callum looked at Blair, then at Hamish, who was emerging slowly from the shadows. There was a sad, resigned smile on the curator's face. "There is no gold," Callum said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly over the wind. "There is only rock, and bone, and history." He held out the paper. Blair snatched it from his hand, shining his torch on it. "What is this?" Blair demanded. This is just a cliff drawing. It's on graph paper. It says site of SI do not disturb." "It's the survey," Callum said. "The real survey. The one St. John tried to burn. I came to put it back, to put the earth back." "You killed him," Blair said, the realization dawning that there was no bullion, only a sad little man in a tweed coat. "You killed him for a pile of rocks?" "I killed him," Callum corrected gently, "because he wouldn't listen. He wanted to break the world, Inspector. Someone had to stop him." Hamish stepped into the light, standing beside Blair. "It looks like you were right, sir," he said, his voice thick with admiration. "It wasn't a robbery. It was a crime of passion, a local fanatic protecting his heritage. You flushed him out. The rumour about the map, it forced his hand." Blair looked at the graph paper, then at Callum, and finally at the excavator. He seemed disappointed that there was no gold, but the prospect of a confession was a powerful consolation prize. "Arrest him," Blair ordered, straightening his coat. "Caution him. And for God's sake, turn that engine off. It's giving me a headache." As Anderson moved to cuff Callum, the little historian looked at Hamish. There was no anger in his eyes, only deep relief. The secret was out, the burden was lifted, and Geordie MacGregor would sleep in his own bed tomorrow night. Hamish gave a barely perceptible nod. The trap had sprung, the truth was exposed, and DCI Blair was already mentally writing the press release that would declare him the saviour of the Highlands. All that remained was the messy business of the arrest, and the quiet satisfaction of a job done without any unseemly credit falling on the wrong shoulders. The wind on the cliffs had shifted, changing from a steady gale to a series of unpredictable, violent gusts that threatened to knock a man off his feet. Detective Chief Inspector Blair, however, seemed anchored by the sheer weight of his own self-satisfaction. He stood in the pool of light cast by the police torches, his chest puffed out like a puffin in mating season, pointing an accusing finger at the slight, trembling figure of Callum MacPhee. "Cuff him, Anderson!" Blair barked, his voice struggling to compete with the roar of the ocean below. "And do it properly this time. I don't want to hear any excuses about rusty hinges. This man is a cold-blooded killer. He strung up a financier like a side of bacon." Callum did not move to resist as Anderson approached, handcuffs shining in the torch's beam. He looked small, defeated, and utterly lost, his eyes fixed not on the detectives but on the dark, churning water hundreds of feet below. "It wasn't cold-blooded," Callum whispered, his voice barely audible. "It was hot. It was a moment of heat. He laughed at the map. He laughed at the history. He said he was going to turn the caves into a themed bistro." "A bistro?" Blair scoffed, stepping closer to gloat. "You killed a man over a restaurant? You're a lunatic, MacPhee. A dangerous, obsession-riddled lunatic. You'll die in prison. You know that, don't you? You'll rot in a concrete box in Barlinnie, and they'll turn your precious museum into a public toilet." It was the wrong thing to say. It was entirely typical of Blair, who possessed the emotional intelligence of a brick, but it was the spark that ignited the final, desperate fuse in Callum's mind. The resignation vanished from the historian's face, replaced by a look of sheer feral panic. "No," he gasped, backing away. "Not a box. I won't go in a box. I belong to the cliffs." "Grab him!" Blair shouted, lunging forward but slipping instantly on the wet clay. Callum didn't attack Blair. He didn't run for the road. He turned and bolted straight for the edge of the precipice. He moved with the surprising, frantic speed of a terrified animal. Anderson was too slow, his hands still fumbling with the cuffs. MacNab was busy helping Blair out of the mud. There was only one person between Callum MacPhee and the fatal drop into the Atlantic. Hamish Macbeth dropped the act. The slouch vanished. The lazy, loping gait was replaced by an explosion of kinetic energy that belied his reputation as the sleepiest policeman in the Highlands. Hamish didn't run, he sprinted, covering the 10 yards of treacherous, slippery ground in seconds. He didn't think about the mud, or the darkness, or the fact that his boots were soaked. He thought only of the little man running toward oblivion. Callum reached the edge. The safety fencing St. John had erected was flimsy, plastic-orange mesh that would stop nothing heavier than a crisp packet. Callum hit it at speed, tearing through it, his momentum carrying him out over the void. "Callum, no!" Hamish roared. Hamish launched himself. He didn't try to grab Callum's arm. He tackled him around the waist, his own momentum carrying them both skidding dangerously close to the crumbling lip of the cliff. They hit the ground hard, the breath driven from Hamish's lungs in a painful whoosh. For a terrifying second, they slid. The mud offered no purchase. Hamish felt his legs dangle over empty space. He could hear the waves crashing against the jagged rocks far below, a sound like thunder. He dug his fingers into the sodden turf, his nails tearing at the grass roots, his other arm locked in a vice-like grip around Callum's waist. "Let me go, Hamish!" Callum screamed, thrashing in the mud. "Let me go! I can't be caged! You're going nowhere, Callum MacPhee!" Hamish gritted out, straining against the pull of gravity. "You're not going to mess with my rocks. Pull yourself up, man!" Hamish hauled. He used every ounce of strength in his lanky frame, muscles burning as he dragged the struggling historian back from the brink. Inch by inch they slid away from death and back onto the solid, albeit muddy, ground of the construction site. Hamish didn't let go until they were a safe distance from the edge. He flipped Callum onto his back and pinned him there, both of them gasping for air, their faces plastered with mud. "You idiot," Hamish panted, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You absolute bloody idiot." Blair, having finally extricated himself from the puddle, scrambled over, his face white with shock that quickly morphed back into anger. "He tried to escape," Blair shrieked, pointing his torch at the pair. "Resisting arrest, attempting to flee the scene. Add it to the charge sheet, Anderson, and Macbeth, get off him. You look like you're wrestling a pig." Hamish slowly climbed to his feet, hauling a sobbing Callum up with him. He dusted off his knees, though it was a futile gesture given that he was covered in slime from neck to toe. He looked at Blair with a level, cold gaze that, for a brief moment, made the DCI step back. "He wasn't escaping, sir," Hamish said quietly. "He was trying to end it, and I'd thank you not to goad the prisoner while he's standing next to a 300-foot drop." "Don't tell me how to do my job, Constable," Blair blustered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "I had the situation under control. I was merely flushing him out." "Aye, sir," Hamish said, the sarcasm dripping from his voice like the rain from his nose. "A masterstroke of psychology. Now perhaps we can get him in the car before anyone else decides to go swimming?" Anderson finally managed to handcuff Callum's wrists. The fight had gone out of the historian. He slumped against the side of the police car, shivering violently, the adrenaline crash leaving him hollowed out. "I'm sorry, Hamish," Callum whispered as Hamish opened the car door for him. The thought of the prison." "I know, Callum," Hamish said softly, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "But the cliffs will still be here when you get out, and St. John won't be building any elevators. You saved the view, even if you went about it the wrong way." "He asked for coffee," Callum murmured, his mind drifting back to the night of the murder. He was shivering. "He asked for coffee. I poured him a cup from my flask. He drank it. He said it was vile. He laughed. And then he told me he was going to burn the map. That's when I pushed him." "It's all right," Hamish said. "Save it for the lawyer. Priscilla has hired a good one for you. Just keep your head down." As the car door slammed shut, separating Callum from the night, Blair marched over to Hamish. The DCI was trying to regain his composure, smoothing his sodden trench coat. "Well," Blair huffed, "that was messy, typical of this place. Nothing is ever straightforward. But I think we can agree that my leadership was decisive." "Oh, absolutely, sir," Hamish said, slipping back into his role of the simpleton subordinate. "If you hadn't shouted at him, he might never have panicked. You forced the issue. It was very brave of you to stand there and direct operations." Blair narrowed his eyes, searching for the insult, but Hamish's face was a mask of muddy innocence. "Yes. Well, make sure you put that in your report. DCI Blair successfully negotiated the surrender of the suspect in hazardous conditions." "And Macbeth?" "Sir, try to clean yourself up. You look like a bog creature. It's unprofessional." "I'll do my best, sir," Hamish said. "I think I might have ruined my good trousers." "Good trousers?" Blair snorted. "I didn't know you owned any. Now get in the Land Rover and follow us. I want this wrapped up tonight. I have a press conference to schedule for the morning." Hamish watched as Blair's car peeled away, tires spinning in the muck. He stood alone on the cliff edge for a moment, listening to the wind. He looked down at the dark water where he had almost ended up. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the reaction to the violence. He hated violence. He hated the waste of it. "Come on, Lugs," he called to the dog, who was sensibly hiding under the Land Rover. "Let's go home. I think we've had quite enough of the great outdoors for one night." He climbed into his vehicle, the heater sputtering into life with a smell of burning dust. As he drove down the winding track, following the red taillights of the convoy, Hamish began to formulate the final part of the plan. Callum was caught, yes, but Blair was too happy, and a happy Blair was a dangerous Blair. He needed to ensure that the credit for this triumph landed so heavily on the DCI that it crushed any notion of Hamish being anything other than a useful idiot. He needed to make sure Hero of the Cliffs was a title that came with a sting in the tail. The following morning, the Lochdubh police station had been transformed into a stage for the final act of Detective Chief Inspector Blair's latest triumph. The mud from the cliffs had been swept away, or at least kicked under the rug, and the DCI himself had undergone a miraculous restoration. Gone was the shivering, terrified man who had slipped in the clay. In his place stood a colossus of law enforcement, smelling of Old Spice and self-satisfaction. He was pacing the floor, dictating his preliminary report to a weary-looking Anderson, while Hamish Macbeth sat in the corner, ostensibly polishing a pair of handcuffs, but mostly just trying to keep his eyes open. "And then," Blair boomed, gesturing grandly with a sausage roll. Realizing the suspect was entering a fugue state brought on by his obsession with the so-called Black Dougal legend, "I made the tactical decision to intervene." Write that down, Anderson. Tactical intervention involving high-risk negotiation on unstable terrain. "Yes, sir," Anderson sighed, scribbling furiously. "And what about Constable Macbeth? He was present." Blair stopped pacing and looked at Hamish with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Macbeth. Well, we have to be accurate, don't we? Put down that he provided local containment. That sounds better than stood around looking like a startled sheep while the real police did the work. And mention that he slipped. It highlights the treacherous conditions I was forced to overcome." "Thank you, sir," Hamish said, looking up with wide, grateful eyes. "I really struggled with the footing. Those city shoes of yours must have a special grip. I was sliding about like a cow on ice." "It's called balance, Macbeth," Blair sneered, finishing the sausage roll in 2 bites. "Core strength. Something you wouldn't know about lounging around in this backwater. Now, the press will be here in an hour. I need a narrative, a hook. Local historian kills developer is a bit dry, it lacks pizzazz." Hamish set the handcuffs down gently. This was the moment. The credit shift was a delicate art, requiring the gentle nudge of a suggestion that the recipient would believe was their own brilliant idea. "Well, sir," Hamish murmured, pouring himself a mug of tea, "there is the matter of the graph paper. And the map. What about them? It's just that, well, Callum MacPhee wasn't just killing a man, he was protecting a legend. The locals are saying he was possessed by the spirit of the cliffs. They say he was acting as the hand of Black Dougal. It's all nonsense, of course, but you know what the Sunday papers are. They love a bit of the Highland curse angle." Blair's eyes lit up. He stopped chewing. "Possessed? A curse? It explains the strength, sir," Hamish continued, buttering a scone. "How a small man like Callum could hoist a 13-stone developer into the air, and why he tried to jump. He said he belonged to the cliffs, didn't he? It's almost supernatural. Of course, a rational man like yourself wouldn't want to be associated with such fairy tales." "Nonsense," Blair interjected, smoothing his thinning hair. "It's not a fairy tale, Macbeth. It's psychological profiling. The public must understand the depth of insanity I was dealing with. I wasn't just fighting a murderer, I was fighting a cultural delusion, landscape isolation-induced mania. It makes my win more impressive. I talked him down from the edge of insanity." "That's a very powerful angle, sir," Hamish said, hiding a smile behind his teacup. "The man who broke the Highland curse. That sounds like a headline." "It does, doesn't it?" Blair preened, checking his reflection in the window. "Anderson, scrap the bit about the debt. Focus on the obsession, the ritualistic aspect of cargo netting, the flag of warning. Make me sound like the only voice of reason in a land of superstition. Hamish relaxed. The bait had been taken. Blair would go out there and spin a tale so melodramatic, so steeped in Highland Gothic, that the serious brass at headquarters in Strathbane would roll their eyes and file him under E for exaggerator. No superintendent wanted a DCI who believed in curses. They wanted boring, efficient police work. By claiming he had battled a cultural delusion, Blair was effectively ensuring he would never be taken seriously for a promotion to the serious crime squad in Glasgow. He was painting himself as the king of the crazies. And Hamish? Hamish was safe. He was just the local Bobby who slipped in the mud and made the tea. The phone rang. It was the superintendent. Blair snatched it up, his voice dropping into his command register. DCI Blair here. Yes, sir. Wrapped it up last night. A tragic case. The suspect, yes, mentally unstable, driven mad by local folklore. I had to physically restrain him on the precipice. Macbeth? Oh, he's here. Well, let's just say he's better suited to traffic control than high-stakes negotiation. He nearly fell off the cliff himself, sir. Clumsy. I had to grab him by the belt. Hamish listened, nodding enthusiastically at the lies. Every insult was a brick in the wall of his job security. A commendation? Blair's voice rose an octave. Well, that is very kind of you, sir, but really I was just doing my duty, protecting the public from forces they don't understand. He slammed the phone, beaming. Did you hear that? He's impressed. He said I'm a unique asset to the force. I'm sure he meant it, sir, Hamish said. Unique is certainly the word. Right. Blair clapped his hands. The press are waiting. I'm going to give them a show. Macbeth, stay here and file the paperwork. And for God's sake, don't speak to any reporters. If they ask you anything, just point them to me. I don't want you mumbling about sheep and ruining the atmosphere. I wouldn't dream of it, sir, Hamish promised. I'll just be here cleaning up the mess. Blair marched out the door, Anderson trailing in his wake like a faithful spaniel. Through the window, Hamish watched as the DCI was instantly swarmed by photographers. He saw Blair strike a pose, 1 foot forward, chin up, gazing steely-eyed toward the mountains, and begin to recount the tale of the cursed cliffs. Hamish sighed, a sound of profound contentment. The danger passed. Callum MacPhee would get a fair hearing thanks to Priscilla's lawyer. Geordie was free and currently enjoying a not guilty pint at the pub, and Hamish Macbeth was, once again, the most underestimated man in Sutherland. He stood up and walked to the door, locking it firmly. He picked up the half-empty packet of biscuits Blair had left behind, a small tax on the DCI's ego, and whistled for lugs. Come on, boy. Hamish said the show is over, the actors have left the stage. And do you know what that means? Lugs wagged his tail, sensing the shift in the universe. It means, Hamish continued, opening the back door that led to his small vegetable patch, that we can finally have that bowl of soup without anyone shouting at us. And I believe Mrs. Wellington mentioned something about a fresh batch of scones. The village of Lochdubh settled back into its damp, grey, comfortable silence. The murder was solved, the dead were at peace, and the living were exactly where they wanted to be, invisible. Hamish Macbeth had shifted the credit, shifted the blame, and most importantly, shifted the spotlight far, far away from his own quiet life. The silence that followed the departure of the media circus was heavy, wet, and profoundly comforting. It was the specific silence of the Highlands after a storm, where the only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves and the distant, rhythmic shushing of the loch against the sea wall. The convoy of police vehicles and press vans had disappeared over the rise of the hill like a receding headache, taking with them the noise, the flashbulbs, and the unbearable ego of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Hamish Macbeth stood on the step of the police station, inhaling the air. It tasted of salt, peat smoke, and the distinct absence of diesel fumes. He watched a single crow land on the telephone wire, bobbing precariously in the breeze. It cawed once, a harsh sound that seemed to say, "They're gone, you fool, get back to bed." But Hamish was too wired for sleep and too hungry for bed. The adrenaline of the cliff rescue was fading. leaving behind a hollow space in his stomach that demanded immediate attention. He locked the station door, a symbolic gesture, as the lock was temperamental and could be opened with a stiff credit card, and set off down the waterfront with Lugs trotting happily at his heels. The village was emerging from its collective hiding. Curtains twitched, doors opened, and Lochdubh's familiar faces began to reclaim their territory. As Hamish passed the general store, Mrs. Macbeth appeared in the doorway, broom in hand, sweeping away the muddy footprints left by the visiting journalists. "Is it true, Hamish?" she called, pausing in her work. "Did Blair really wrestle a madman on the edge of the abyss?" Hamish stopped, leaning against the rough-cast wall. "That is the official version, Mrs. Macbeth. The DCI was very animated. He certainly did a lot of shouting." "And Callum?" Her voice dropped, losing its gossipy edge. Will he be all right?" "He has a good lawyer," Hamish reassured her. "Priscilla's father saw to that. And the judge will likely take a dim view of a developer who tried to bulldoze a heritage site. I suspect Callum will be back polishing his ploughs in a few years, with a few stories to tell." Mrs. Macbeth nodded, satisfied. "Good. The man makes a terrible cup of tea, but he knows his history. And that St. John, well, he won't be missed. I heard the bank is already repossessing the excavator. Nature is repossessing the cliffs," Hamish corrected gently. "The wind will blow the fence down by Tuesday." He continued his patrol, which looked remarkably like a man aimlessly wandering in search of a free meal. He stopped at the Lochdubh Hotel, slipping in through the kitchen entrance. The atmosphere inside was steamy and smelled of roasting lamb. Mrs. Wellington, the formidable cook who terrorized guests and staff alike, was bashing a saucepan with a wooden spoon. "You!" she barked, spotting Hamish before he could blend into the shadows. "Don't think you can sneak in here like a stray cat. I saw you on the news. Or rather, I saw Blair's big red face blocking out the sun, and you lurking in the background like a spare part. I was providing local containment," Hamish said, quoting Blair with a straight face. "It's very technical work. It makes a man hungry." "You're always hungry," she grumbled, but she reached for a plate and ladled a generous portion of stew onto it. "Here, eat. You look like a beanpole that's been left out in the rain. And don't let the dog lick the floor." Hamish ate standing up, the warmth of the stew spreading through his chest. It was simple, hearty food, the kind that St. John would have sneered at, and it tasted like victory. As he wiped the plate clean with a piece of crusty bread, the door to the dining room swung open, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe walked in. She looked tired, but the tension around her eyes had eased. She was wearing a raincoat over her cashmere, and her boots were muddy. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "Foraging, refueling," Hamish corrected, putting the plate down. "The investigation is closed. The paperwork is filed. Blair is currently composing his memoirs in the back of a squad car. Father is relieved," Priscilla said, leaning against the counter. "He was worried the construction would ruin the grouse shooting next season. He seems to have forgotten that a man died. St. John died of his own ambition," Hamish said softly. "He dug a hole and fell into it. Callum just helped him with the gravity. It's a sad business, Priscilla, but the village is safe. The cliffs are safe. For now," she said, "until the next rich man with a vision comes along." "Then we'll deal with him too," Hamish shrugged. "Lochdubh has a way of chewing them up. The weather gets them, or the boredom, or the fact that you can't get a decent espresso." They looked at each other for a long moment. It was the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's rhythms perfectly, but were destined to dance to different tunes. Priscilla belonged to the castle and the world beyond. Hamish belonged to the station house and the peat fire. "I have to go to London next week," Priscilla said, breaking the spell. "Business. I won't be back until Christmas." "I'll be here," Hamish said, checking the sheep, avoiding the superintendent. "Take care of yourself, Hamish, and try not to fall off any more cliffs. I'll do my best." She turned and left, the kitchen suddenly feeling a little colder without her presence. Hamish thanked Mrs. Wellington, who threatened him with a ladle if he didn't get out, and stepped back into the drizzle. The walk back to the police station was slow. The rain had turned gentle, a soft mist that blurred the edges of the mountains. He passed the church, where the minister was nailing a notice to the board about the evils of gambling, a pointed reference, Hamish suspected, to Geordie's recent windfall. He reached the station and let himself in. The fire in the stove had died to embers. He threw on a couple of fresh peats and waited until the flames licked up, casting a warm orange glow across the room. He took off his boots, placing them by the fender to dry, and sank into his battered armchair. Luggs circled 3 times on the rug before collapsing with a groan of pure ecstasy. Hamish watched him, feeling a similar weight lift from his own shoulders. There were no more maps to decipher, no more bodies swinging in the wind, no more shouting. He reached for the percolator and set it on the stove. As the water began to bubble, filling the room with the rich, dark scent of coffee, the good stuff he kept hidden from Blair, Hamish Macbeth finally allowed himself to smile. He pulled a battered paperback western from his pocket, one he had read a dozen times before. He opened it to the first page, where the hero was riding into a town that needed saving. Hamish didn't need to save a town. He had already done it. And the best part was, nobody knew he had done a thing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane in its frame. It was a wild, lonely sound, the song of the Highlands, but inside it was warm. The coffee was ready. The dog was asleep. And Constable Hamish Macbeth was officially, delightfully, off duty. The village of Lochdubh had a way of healing over its scars, much like the heather that grew back stronger after a burning. 2 days after the arrest of Callum MacPhee and the departure of the media circus, the only evidence that a murder had taken place was the lingering smell of wet ash in the police station stove and a slight, nervous tick in Mrs. Maccrum's eye whenever she sold a stamp. Hamish Macbeth, however, was a man who didn't like loose ends. He sat at his desk, staring at the charred remains of the graph paper map in the grate. Callum had confessed to the killing, and Blair had claimed credit for the capture, but there was one small, nagging detail that sat in Hamish's mind like a stone in a boot. St. John had been obsessed. Desperate men grasp at straws, but they don't buy heavy machinery unless they are convinced the straw is made of gold. Callum had drawn a fake map to a dangerous place, yes, but he had based it on something. A man like Callum, a custodian of truth, wouldn't have known how to lie so convincingly unless he knew exactly what the truth looked like. "Come on, Luggs," Hamish sighed, standing up and reaching for his cap. "One last walk, just to be sure the ghosts are sleeping." The afternoon was bright and crisp, the kind of Highland day that makes tourists reach for their cameras and locals reach for their thickest jumpers. Hamish drove the Land Rover up the familiar, winding track to the cliffs. The yellow excavator was gone, repossessed by a bank in Glasgow, leaving behind only a muddy scar in the turf. When he arrived, he found he wasn't alone. Archie McLean was standing at the edge of the precipice, leaning on a shovel. The fisherman looked as he always did, weathered, taciturn, and seemingly carved from the same granite as the cliffs. He was staring down into the dark, churning water of the bay. "Afternoon, Archie," Hamish said, joining him at the edge. "Doing a spot of gardening. It's a bit exposed for petunias." Archie didn't look up. He spat into the wind. "Filling in holes, Hamish. That Englishman made a mess. The sheep will break their legs if we don't smooth it over." "Aye," Hamish agreed. He was a man for making holes, in the ground and in people's lives. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind whipping around them. "Callum was a fool," Archie said suddenly. "He should have told him the truth. St. John would have gone away if he'd known." "Know what?" Hamish asked softly. "That there was no gold." Archie finally turned to look at Hamish. His eyes were crinkled against the sun, blue and sharp. That there was gold, but not the kind he could spend. Hamish felt a little thrill of realization. The smuggler's hoard. It wasn't a myth, was it? "Black Dougal was my great-great-grandfather," Archie said matter-of-factly. "He wasn't a rich man. He was a runner. He ran brandy and salt to avoid the tax. He didn't hide gold bars, Hamish. He hid his inventory." Archie gestured with the shovel toward a small, innocent-looking fissure in the rock, barely visible behind a clump of gorse. It was the exact spot where St. John had been trying to dig, only he had been using a sledgehammer where a key was needed. St. John was close, Archie muttered. Too close. That's why Callum panicked. He wasn't protecting a legend. He was protecting reality. If St. John had found it, the government would have swarmed all over us. Archaeologists, taxmen, tourists. They'd have fenced it off and charged us £5 to look at our own history. "Show me," Hamish said. Archie hesitated, then nodded. He moved the gorse aside and squeezed through the fissure. Hamish followed, lugs whining nervously at the entrance. Inside, the cave was small, damp, and smelled of centuries of salt and rot. But there, stacked against the back wall, were 3 wooden kegs. They were black with age, the iron hoops rusted to flakes. Beside them lay a pile of what looked like leather sacks, disintegrated by time, revealing a spill of grey dust that might once have been tobacco or salt. "There it is," Archie said, his voice echoing in the small space. "The smuggler's hoard. 3 barrels of French brandy, vintage 1750, and a bag of salt." Hamish stepped closer. He touched one of the barrels. The wood was soft, almost spongy. Is it still good?" "Good?" Archie laughed, a dry barking sound. "Hamish, the air got to it 100 years ago. It'll be vinegar. Strong, black vinegar. That's what St. John died for. That's what Callum went to jail for. A salad dressing." Hamish looked at the barrels. It was the perfect Highland joke. The great treasure, the thing that had driven a man to murder and another to madness, was nothing more than spoiled liquor. It was worthless. And yet Hamish knew, if word got out, it would be priceless. The media would spin it into a romantic discovery. The cliffs would be overrun. The peace of Lochdubh would be shattered forever. "It's a fine vintage, Archie," Hamish said solemnly. "Too fine for the likes of us." "Aye," Archie agreed, "and too fine for the government." Hamish looked at the shovel in Archie's hand. He looked at the loose shale of the cave roof. It was already crumbling, vibrating slightly with the force of the waves below. "You know," Hamish mused, "if a man were to lean heavily on that pillar there, the entrance might just collapse. It would be a terrible shame. A loss to history." Archie grinned, revealing a set of teeth that had seen better days. "A terrible shame, Hamish. A tragedy." Hamish stepped back out into the sunlight, lugs greeting him with a frantic wag of the tail. He waited while Archie did the work. It took 3 sharp blows with the shovel and a heavy shove. There was a rumble, a cloud of dust, and a dull thud as the rock face shifted, sealing the fissure forever behind a wall of grey granite. "Gone," Archie said, dusting his hands. "Just another rockfall." "What treasure?" Hamish asked innocently. "Exactly." They returned to the Land Rover together. The secret was safe. The gold was vinegar, and the vinegar was buried. It was the only justice the Highlands knew how to give. Silence. "You're a good man, Hamish," Archie said as he turned to walk back to his own truck. "For a policeman. And you're a terrible gardener, Archie," Hamish replied. "But I won't report you to the council." Hamish drove back down the hill, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He parked in front of the station and walked inside. The phone was ringing. He knew who it was. It would be the superintendent, or perhaps a journalist looking for a follow-up quote on the curse of the cliffs. He picked up the receiver and held it over the waste paper basket. He let it drop. He walked to the stove and picked up the coffee pot. He poured 2 mugs, one for himself and a saucer for Lugs. He sat down in his armchair, the springs groaning in protest, and propped his feet up on the desk. Through the window, he could see the sun beginning to set over the loch, painting the water in shades of gold and violet. It was the only gold that mattered, and it was free for everyone to see. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, taking a sip of the hot, strong coffee, "we solved the crime, we saved the village, and we buried the treasure. I think we've earned a quiet night." Lugs yawned, curled into a ball, and went to sleep. Hamish Macbeth closed his eyes. He thought about Priscilla, and the look she had given him. He thought about Callum, who would be safe, and he thought about Blair, polishing his commendation in Strathbane. "Let them have the glory," Hamish whispered to the empty room. "I'll take the view." And with that, the High Constable of Lochdubh drifted into a doze, perfectly content in the knowledge that tomorrow he would have absolutely nothing to do.